Once again, in the name of the triune God, I pray that grace and peace may be multiplied to you in the knowledge of Jesus Christ through the power of the Holy Spirit and to the glory of God the Father. I want to invite you to turn your Bibles with me to the first chapter of the book of 1 Samuel. 1 Samuel chapter 1. As you're turning there, I do want to read another passage that's just kind of been on my mind this last week. It's in an obscure little corner of the New Testament in a small little book called 3 John. You know, 3 John is so short, it doesn't even have chapters in it. It's just broken up by verses. But in the fourth verse of this little epistle of 3 John, John said something that just really resonated with my heart this last week. 3 John 4 says this, I have no greater joy than to hear that my children are walking in the truth. I love that. I love that. That verse has just resonated in my heart this last week because of just how true I know that to be. Just as a pastor, as a shepherd, there truly is no greater joy in my life than to know that you are walking in the truth, and then to know that you are walking with the Lord. And that's what I pray for each and every one of you for every week. You know, I do not believe that you are here this morning by mistake. I believe that your presence with us this morning is actually a direct answer to prayer, because I have prayed for you this week by name, person by person, just asking that God would bless you, that you would walk with him, that just as John talks about in this verse, that you would walk in the truth, and especially that you would be blessed by the truth that we're going to explore together this morning in this wonderful book of 1 Samuel. Now, we've spent the last couple of sermons kind of gearing up for where we're going to this morning and actually getting into the text of 1 Samuel itself. And I hope and trust that you did have the opportunity this last week to go ahead and read this passage in advance, because we will not be able to read all of it because it's such a long passage. That's just kind of the nature of Old Testament preaching. Also, just kind of FYI, I'm going to be announcing the coming week's texts the week before. And you can find that in 3 different places if you're going to follow along with us. You'll find it in the Cool Connections newsletter. There will be a little section there under the sermon that says, hey, next week, next Sunday, this is the passage that Drew will be preaching on. You'll find it in the sermon notes sheet in your bulletin, actually. It's right there listed for you. And it's also in the sermon notes sheet in the Cool Church app. So you can find it in any of those locations. But I would just really encourage you to try and read those passages in advance so you can get the full flow of the story before we come together. Now, next week's going to be really easy. It's just going to be 1 Samuel 2, 1 through 10. So that's all that we have for this coming Sunday. We're actually going to just kind of pump the brakes and slow it down, just hit those 10 verses because there's something really magnificent there. And then we're actually going to take a couple of weeks off, but in mid-August, I plan to get back to 1 Samuel in earnest, and my plan, laugh as you may, is to get all the way through chapter 17 by the end of the year. So in the next 6 months or so. Now, I know some of you are thinking it took you 2 years to do 7 chapters in the 1st and 2nd Peter, but have faith, friends. We are going to be moving at quite a clip through this material. But as we jump into the text this morning, I do just want to remind you that this was a hopeless time in the life of Israel. This was a hopeless time in the life of Israel. We really cannot overstate what a hopeless time this was. I'm sure you remember the hopelessness of the days of the judges. We've talked about it several times already. When there was no king in Israel and everyone did that which was right in his own eyes. Well, as we enter into 1 Samuel, especially in these first 3 verses, we find something of a microcosm of that hopelessness. And look at it with me. 1 Samuel chapter 1, verses 1 through 3. There was a certain man of Ramathaim Zophim of the hill country of Ephraim, whose name was Elkanah, the son of Jeroham, son of Elihu, son of Tohu, son of Zuph, an Ephrathite. He had 2 wives. The name of the one was Hannah, and the name of the other Peninnah. And Peninnah had children, but Hannah had no children. Now this man used to go up year by year from his city to worship and to sacrifice to the Lord of hosts at Shiloh, where the 2 sons of Eli, Hophni and Phinehas, were priests of the Lord. Again, it starts off in verse 1. There was a certain man of Ramathaim Zophim of the hill country of Ephraim whose name was Elkanah. Just to kind of orient you a little bit to where all this was, this is the location of Ramathaim Zophim here. It's the most likely location. Ramah, this space right here, close to Mizpah. It's a hard one to identify, but it's something along these lines. Here's another view of where Ramah might be. And here's another one here. Looking at, you can see the Mount of Olives, Jerusalem, kind of gives you a sense of where about we are. And this is Ramah. That's where Elkanah and his family were from. It's about 5 miles north of Jerusalem. Elkanah and his family probably lived in a house that's not too much unlike this house right here, actually. This would be very much like what those houses looked like. It would have been what's called an Israelite 4-room house. So this is known throughout the archaeological world, these 4-room houses. Whenever you find a house of this construction, that's an Israelite house, basically wherever you go. And this might look like the interior of that house. Now, verse 2 is then where we start to really re-engage with the hopelessness and the sadness of this time when we read this about Elkanah. He had 2 wives. The name of the one was Hannah, and the name of the other Peninnah. And Peninnah had children, but Hannah had no children. It starts right there at the very first clause of verse 2. He had 2 wives. Now, while in the ancient world it was sometimes necessary for a man to have multiple wives, and it does seem like this may have been one of those cases, it was always, nonetheless, problematic. There are no good stories in the Bible about a man with multiple wives. Every story is bad, bad, bad. Every time we see polygamy in the Bible, it is painted in the worst possible light, and this story is no exception to that. And we start to get an idea about why Elkanah may have had 2 wives. This devout man, as we continue reading in verse 2, it says, and Peninnah had children, but Hannah had none. It seems that what probably happened was that Elkanah married Hannah, really the love of his life, first. But when it became clear that she was unable to have children, then he married Peninnah as kind of his backup plan. Because the needs of the family were that they needed to have a male heir. That was just kind of part of what life was like back then. Now, in doing that, in marrying Peninnah, he did get what he wanted, which was children. He also got something that he did not want, which was serious family strife. Can you imagine? 2 women under the same roof. I mean, Lord help us all. Like, it's just bad news. So what we have as we enter into this is a very unfortunate situation. It's a sad situation. It's not unprecedented. This kind of thing did happen in the ancient world. In some ways, again, it was kind of part of life under the sun in a Genesis 3 world. But nonetheless, it was sad and it was hard. Now you go to verse 3, and verse 3 actually just presses this hopelessness of these times even further. When we read this, it says, now this man used to go up year by year from his city to worship and to sacrifice to the Lord of hosts at Shiloh, where the two sons of Eli, Hophni and Phinehas, were priests to the Lord. And what's interesting about verse 3 is that up to this point, all of the names that we've been introduced to have all been Israelite names. These are all Hebrew names. Elkanah means, ironically enough, God created a son. Hannah means grace. Even Peninnah means ruby. But as we make our way to the tabernacle, to the Holy of Holies, where Yahweh himself resides, where we would expect to find the most devout, the most spiritually mature men, we're introduced to two more names. But surprisingly, these are not Hebrew names. They're Egyptian names. These are the kinds of names that sinners give to their children. But these are the children of the high priest. That's what's so surprising about verse 3. Hophni is an Egyptian name which means tadpole. I have no idea why they chose that name. And Phinehas is an Egyptian name that means Nubian. And so as we move into these first few chapters of 1 Samuel, again, we're going to find that these men in particular, Hophni and Phinehas, that these were priests. These were the religious leaders of the day. These were supposed to be the holy men of Israel. But these two men in particular were so wicked, just ungodly, depraved men, and yet they are leading worship for the entire nation. So what we have is, on a national scale, there is no king in Israel, and everyone does what is right in their own eyes. It's a failed state. On a religious level, it is a failed religious system led by corrupt priests. And you get all the way down to this nuclear family, and it's so sad. It is so ugly, with a barren woman and a man married to multiple wives. And so you finish the first 3 verses of chapter 1, and you should just feel depressed. It's just hopeless. And then all of that sets us up for the rest of the story, which is a story about Hannah. And in that story, there's 3 big movements. There's a story of real grief in Hannah's life in verses 1 through 8. There is a story about heartfelt prayer. That's verses 9 through 20. And finally, there's a story about real sacrifice. That's 121 through 2:11. Let's see if we can take a look at the grief of the story to begin with. Again, in verse 3, it says that every year Elkanah would gather his whole family together, and they would go to Shiloh. And Shiloh is where the tabernacle was. And this is a picture of the route that they would take to go from Ramah to Shiloh. It's about 15 miles to the north. So it's going to be a good day's hike for them to get from Ramah all the way to Shiloh. And when they got there, they would have seen something along these lines. This is the city of Shiloh here, the remains of Shiloh. And this space right here is potentially where the tabernacle rested. It's a large, flat area where the tabernacle could have easily been set up at Shiloh. Now, of course, the goal of the journey to Shiloh was ultimately to get to the tabernacle. This is ultimately where they were trying to get to, because the tabernacle, this was the house of Yahweh. This was the place where Yahweh himself dwelt. This is where God lived. And so they would come to the tabernacle in order to sacrifice to worship through sacrifice and to meet with Yahweh. Now, when we think of sacrifice, oftentimes we just think of the blood and the gore of the whole thing. And it was bloody and it was gory, but it was more than that. Sacrifice in the Old Testament especially meant something to those people that it doesn't necessarily mean to us. You see, when we want to eat like good smoked meats, we go to Pastor Drew's house, right? But before that, typically, someone's gone to the grocery store and bought a very nice pre-packaged cellophane-wrapped thing of meat, which you take home and then you cook. That is not the way ancient people lived. When you were going to eat meat, it was typically going to be connected to a sacrifice. The sacrifice was bringing that most precious and valuable thing, livestock, and giving some of that to the Lord through sacrifice and a burnt offering, and enjoying a meal together as a family. And that's kind of what's happening in verses 4 and 5, if you look at that with me. On the day when Elkanah sacrificed, he would give portions to Peninnah, his wife, and to all her sons and daughters. Don't miss the all there. This is a very fertile woman, all her sons and daughters. But to Hannah, who was barren, he gave a double portion because he loved her, though the Lord had closed her womb. And this is where the story starts to take a really ugly turn at verse 6. And her rival, Peninnah, used to provoke her grievously, to irritate her, because Yahweh had closed her womb. And you can just hear this mouthy, overly fertile thorn in Hannah's flesh, subtly, and maybe not so subtly, provoking Hannah as the family sat down to enjoy a sacrificial meal. Actually, the word for provoke there is the word to thunder against her. Peninnah would thunder against Hannah during these sacrificial meals to drive her to despair. You can almost hear Peninnah. Now, do all of you children have enough food? Oh my, it's hard to keep track of all of the children that I have. It must be so much easier for poor Hannah, who has no children, to keep track of, or something along those lines. You might think of one of Peninnah's children chiming in, Mommy, why doesn't Miss Hannah have any children? Doesn't she want children? Or doesn't Daddy want Miss Hannah to have children? And Peninnah might respond, I'm sure Miss Hannah would love to have children. I'm sure Daddy would love for Miss Hannah to have children, but she just keeps disappointing your poor daddy. How sad. I wonder if perhaps God is angry at Miss Hannah because he certainly is happy with me. Look at, as the verse says, all my children. And then in verse 7, and don't miss the first part of verse 7. This is so important. So it went on year by year. This is not a one-time event. This is the warp and woof of Hannah's life. So it went on year by year. As often as she went up to the house of Yahweh, she used to provoke her. Therefore, Hannah wept and would not eat. And Elkanah, her husband, said to her, Hannah, why do you weep? This is a very sensitive man, obviously. I meant that ironically. Why do you not eat? Why is your heart sad? Am I not more to you than 10 sons? I think he means well. But Job's counselors are not hard to find. And that's how he was functioning there. And friends, that was Hannah's life. It was an endless string of monthly disappointments and ongoing grief, made endlessly worse by a mouthy, overly fertile woman whom she had to share a home and a husband with. I guess from one perspective, if you look at the life of Hannah, you could be tempted to think that she's actually got it pretty good, all things considered. She is not the Levite's concubine. That's better, if you remember that story from the end of Judges. In fact, Hannah had just about everything a Jewish woman in 1100 BC could want. She had a husband of very high social standing. We know he was of high social standing because we get his ancestry. And she had a husband who was at least of moderate wealth. It was very expensive to have two wives. In fact, when I lived in Israel, so Muslims are allowed to have multiple wives. Whenever we would get into a taxi cab, we would always ask, so how many wives do you have? And he said, I can only afford just the one wife. Because it is expensive. So Hannah is married to at least a moderately wealthy man. And she was married to a man who genuinely loved and cared for her. And he was a truly devout man. So she had a lot going for her. But nonetheless, there was something missing from Hannah's life. Or maybe better yet, there was someone missing in her life. And his absence was a real grief to her. But there was nothing she could do about it. There's absolutely nothing she could do about the fact that she was barren. Hannah was an unhappy member of the fellowship of barrenness. She shared a seat at the table with women such as Sarah, Abraham's wife, whose barrenness hangs like a dark cloud over 10 chapters of the book of Genesis. And she was a fellow sufferer with women like Rebecca and Rachel, Manoah's wife, and even Elizabeth from the first chapters of the Gospel of Luke. And what all of these women had in common was that they found themselves in a situation that was totally beyond their control and totally beyond their ability to fix. And there's a lesson for us in that. You see, it's when we find ourselves in that kind of extremity, in that kind of a hopeless situation where we are beyond all human help, that is when we find a God who loves to act and to bring about the impossible just for the sake of his children. You see, our God has a tendency to do great things with people who have absolutely reached the end of themselves. He seems to take just uncanny pleasure in working through our hopelessness, in working through our helplessness. It seems to be the case that when God's people are just without strength, without resources, and without hope, that seems to be the moment that God so often chooses to stretch forth his hand and to do the impossible. And maybe you're here this morning and you find yourself in a situation like that today. Maybe you're here and like Hannah, you have longed for children. And yet every month brings a fresh disappointment. And you've reached the end of yourself. Or maybe you're here and like Elkanah, your home is filled with strife. And no matter what you do, you don't seem to be able to help or make it any better. Or maybe it's a little less acute than that. Maybe in your case, it's just the dull, throbbing, aching sense that this isn't the way that you thought your life was going to turn out. I'm not sure what it might be for you, but I am sure of this. However hopeless the situation you may find yourself in, the way forward will be to follow in Hannah's footsteps through heartfelt prayer. And that's the next motion in the story that drives the story that much further in verses 9 through 20. Hannah's heartfelt prayer. After the most recent sacrificial meal, Hannah gets up from the table. She runs through the room. You can hear her great, just heaving sobs of grief as she makes her way down the hallway and as she starts to just pour out her heart to God. Look at verse 10. She was deeply distressed and prayed to Yahweh and wept bitterly. Deeply distressed, prays to Yahweh, and wept bitterly. You know, that reminds me of the story of Jesus' cousin, John the Baptist, when he was murdered by Herod. We just read this not too long ago in our Bible reading plan. Over in Matthew 14:12, it talks about what happened after John the Baptist was murdered. It says, and his disciples came, they took the body and buried it, and catch this, and they went and told Jesus. They went and told Jesus. You know, friends, there's times in life when there really is nothing left to do but to go tell Jesus and to pour out your heart like Hannah did, like these disciples did, just to pour out your heart to the Rock of Ages and to cling to him as the storms just rage all around you. That's why the psalmist said in Psalm 62:8, trust in him at all times, O people. And then he invites us, pour out your heart before him, for God is a refuge for us. And I don't know, maybe that's why you're here this morning. Because you just needed someone to once again remind you to just go and tell Jesus what you're going through and to pour out your heart to him. Because friend, he's waiting to hear from you. I would encourage you to take a page from Hannah's book. Take some time this week and you go tell Jesus what's on your heart. Pour out your heart. Don't be afraid to cry in front of him. Now, verse 11 is interesting. It says, and she vowed a vow and said, O, in your English translation, O Lord of hosts. In the Hebrew, this is the second place in the Hebrew Bible that God's name, God's most exalted name, Yahweh Tsabaoth, is used. The first was actually up here in verse 3, when it says Elkanah went to worship Yahweh Tsabaoth year by year. Hannah picks up on that in this vow. O Yahweh Tsabaoth. God has many names in the Bible. God has many names. This is a special name, though. You might remember the words to Martin Luther's famous hymn, A Mighty Fortress is Our God. Lord Sabaoth, his name, from age to age to the same. His kingdom is forever. That's Yahweh Tsabaoth. That's what Martin Luther was picking up on. It means the Lord of hosts, the Lord who is in control of all human armies, the Lord who is in control of all of the celestial beings, the Lord who is in control of all of the angelic beings, the Lord whose omnipotence knows no bounds, the Lord Almighty, the Lord of hosts. This God, this Yahweh, who is sovereign over all the powers of heaven and of the earth. And that name, Yahweh Tsabaoth, the Lord of hosts, it causes us, it forces us to stretch our imagination in a desperate attempt to try to catch up with his magnificent omnipotence. That was the kind of God that Hannah needed because she was in a desperate place, hopeless. She didn't just need any old God. She needed the Lord of hosts to hear her. And I can't get over her audacity. Think about it for a moment. The audacity of this obscure Israelite woman in the hill country of Ephraim, just assuming that Yahweh Sabaoth would care anything for her problems. It's remarkable that she would think that. Because that's not how the ancients thought of their gods. Not in any way. The gods of the ancients could not be relied upon to hear prayers, or certainly not to care about the small lives of the people under their control. And listen to this. This is a prayer from around 650 BC. It's from Ashurbanipal's library in Nineveh. It was discovered in an archaeological dig. It's a prayer from an Assyrian to his gods. He says, "The God whom I know or do not know has oppressed me. The goddess whom I know or do not know has placed suffering upon me. Although I am constantly looking for help, no one takes me by the hand. When I weep, they do not come to my side. I utter laments, but no one hears me." You see, friends, these were the gods of the ancients. But just notice how different Hannah's God is. He truly is Yahweh Tsabaoth. He is the Lord of hosts, the Lord omnipotent, who hears and cares about the needs of his people. He is an utterly different God from all other gods. And I would just remind you this morning that this same God, the God of Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and Hannah, that this same God hears our prayers as well. Prayers that seem absolutely impossible and almost too big to pray, and prayers that are just really small on a part of our very small lives. He hears them all. He cares for them all. Now, what Hannah prays for and vows in this vow is deliverance. And she prays that a son would be born to her. And so she makes a vow. She makes a vow that if God will answer her prayer and give her a son, then she will give that son back to the Lord to serve him, and that her son will be what's called a Nazirite. Now, a Nazirite was a unique calling. It was a man who had his whole life dedicated to the Lord. And that's the part at the end of verse 11 about no razor touching his head. That's a Nazirite vow. It was part of the Nazirite vow, along with abstaining from alcohol and a few other things. And this isn't an exact comparison, but it's similar. These are Orthodox Jewish men in Jerusalem. And you see these long sideburns that they have? That's part of their devotion to the Lord. Now, Nazirites didn't look quite like that, but the idea is similar. They would have this long flowing hair. No razor had ever touched their heads. And so she promises, God, if you will give me a son as I've asked, I will give him back to you. He will be dedicated to you for all of his life. Well, then in verse 12, we're introduced to Eli once again. It says, as she continued praying before Yahweh, Eli observed her mouth. And so this high priest, with all of the subtlety of a blunt axe, accuses Hannah then of being drunk because she was in such despair as she just poured out her heart to the Lord that her lips were moving, but she was just speaking to the Lord in her heart. And Hannah is just aghast that she's being accused of being a drunken woman. So she explains herself to this bumbling old man, and he asks that the God of Israel would then grant her request. And so then we pick up the story again in verses 19 and 20. They rose early in the morning and worshiped before Yahweh. Then they went back to their house at Ramah, and Elkanah knew Hannah, his wife, and Yahweh remembered her. And in due time, Hannah conceived and bore a son. And she called his name Samuel, for she said, I have asked him from the Lord. And so God remembered Hannah, just as he remembered Noah, just as he remembered his own people who were slaves in Egypt. and just as he remembers us as well. And I think this story is just a beautiful reminder to us that God has not forgotten us. Whatever it is you might have going on in your life right now, I can assure you of this, that you are not forgotten. And we need to hear that. Because, when you're in the valley, when all hope just seems lost around you, it seems as if God has forgotten you. It seems as if God has moved on. And that's one of the reasons why we need these kinds of stories. If for no other reason than just to be reminded that just like in the case of Hannah, God remembers you. He knows your name. He knows exactly what's going on in your life. And you are very much on his heart, even at this moment. We probably should start kind of wrapping up the story here. In this very last portion of the story, we read about Hannah's real sacrifice, real grief, heartfelt prayer, real sacrifice. God gives Hannah a son. Now, Hannah decided she wanted to wait until the boy was weaned before taking him back to the tabernacle. And at this point in ancient history, that would have been when he was about 3 years old. So at the age of around 3 years old, we pick up the story in verses 24 and 25. And when she had weaned him, she took him up with her, along with a 3-year-old bull, an ephah of flour, and a skin of wine. And she brought him to the house of Yahweh at Shiloh. And the child was young. And then they slaughtered the bull, and they brought the child to Eli. And I think there's some discrepancy here, but rather than in verse 24 it being a 3-year-old bull, I think it might be an even better translation as 3 bulls. I don't think it was that she brought just a 3-year-old bull. It's that she brought 3 bulls to sacrifice. Again, you see the extravagance here. Real sacrifice. That was 3 times more than she was supposed to do. So we have this extravagant, real sacrifice that she's making. And in verse 27, after she speaks with Eli, she says, "For this child I prayed, and the Lord has granted me my petition that I made to him. And therefore I have lent him to the Lord. As long as he lives, he is lent to the Lord." And he worshiped the Lord there. And in the Hebrew text, there are 4 occasions in just those 2 verses where Hannah uses the word asked. This is a more literal translation. It says, "For this child I prayed, and Yahweh gave me my asking, which I asked from him. And I also have given him back what was asked to Yahweh. All the days he lives, he is one that is asked for Yahweh." And that's why she named the child Samuel. Because Samuel means, "For Yahweh I asked him." And what's just so remarkable about this part of the story is that this son that Hannah had prayed for, that Hannah had asked for, that Hannah had longed for such a long time. I mean, truly just the joy and the delight of her heart, this son whom she loves so much, she takes back to the tabernacle and hands him over to the Lord. And that's a sacrifice. A sacrifice is laying down that which is most precious to you, that which is most dear to you, and simply entrusting it to the Lord's care. That's what a sacrifice is. It's not giving God your leftovers, the extra. Sacrifice is giving God the best. And for Hannah, the best was her own son, the son whom she loved. Now, we're going to look at Hannah's song in 2:1-10 next week. But I think you have to admit, even up to this point, this is a pretty good story, isn't it? I can't help but think of the old hymn, God Moves in Mysterious Ways. Any of you remember that old one? God moves in a mysterious way, his wonders to perform. He plants his footsteps in the sea and rides upon the storm. Judge not the Lord by feeble sense, but trust him for his grace. Behind a frowning providence, he hides a smiling face. His purposes will ripen fast, unfolding every hour. The bud may have a bitter taste, but sweet will be the flower. Ye fearful saints, fresh courage take. The clouds you so much dread are big with mercy and shall break in blessings on your head. You know, that's Hannah's story. Friends, we just never know what God is doing behind the scenes, especially in our suffering. Suffering like Hannah endured. In fact, it seems to me that suffering is often God's choicest means of raising up the poor, of blessing the barren, and of bringing hope to the destitute. You see, if it were not for Peninnah and her ongoing mockery and malice towards Hannah, Hannah probably never would have prayed that way. That suffering that Hannah endured was the means that God used to ultimately give us Samuel, who, of course, ultimately gave us David, Israel's greatest king. You see, our God is a God who has a habit of turning darkness into light and of turning evil upon its own head in order to work salvation for his people. We see that in Hannah's story, certainly. But of course, there's no place in all of the Bible and there's no place in all of human history where we see that more clearly than the cross of Jesus Christ. You see, Jesus was really and truly forsaken so that we might never be forsaken. He endured that kind of pain that we might be filled with hope. He was mocked so that we could be honored. He was tortured so that we could be freed. And he was killed so we could be born again. And I would be remiss this morning if I didn't at least ask, friend, do you know him? The story is about Hannah and it's about Samuel and it's the Old Testament, but ultimately this is really about Jesus. And so I would just ask you once again, friend, do you know him? Have you met the Lord Jesus Christ and surrendered your life to him? Because he is the only one that can take your darkness and turn it into light. He is the only one that can take the hopelessness of your pain and turn it into joy. He is the only one that can guarantee you a hope and a future. And it's my deepest desire that you would call out to him and meet him this morning and trust in him for your salvation. Let's pray. Father, what a story. This happened some 3,000 years ago, more than 3,000 years ago, but it's still speaking to us today. We can so easily relate to this poor woman and her suffering. And we can so easily relate to the joy of this story. And we see that in our own lives as well. Father, I pray for anybody who's here this morning who doesn't know Christ, that true and greater David. Lord, I pray that they would turn to him this morning, trust in him, and believe in the gospel. We ask all of this in Christ's name. Amen.